Thank you very much indeed, and it's an absolute delight and honour to be here. Um, it's hard to say this, but this is not going to be a cheerful session. Um, I'm very sorry, but the world economy is in a bad shape, and the automotive sector, as you know, is stuck right in the middle. So I thought I'd start just by cheering everyone up. Okay, where are we in terms of trade, in terms of the automotive sector, and in terms of global political risk? Well, if we start really cheerfully, we could look at what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and we could say the whole process of trade and supply chains has been weaponized. Absolutely everything from energy prices through to semiconductors, through to rare metals, everything has been weaponized. And at the moment, we're puzzled about whether or not we can trade. Well, we almost certainly can't trade with Russia, Belarus. It's limited our supply chains. It's made parts of our supply chains really difficult to access. So the whole process of dealing across borders has become very complicated. For the car sector, that's important because in the UK, we import 60% in order to export one thing. So it's actually, we're very reliant on imports and supply chains. So that's an important dimension. So what that means, of course, is that critical supply chains are threatened. So things like semiconductors, things like basic components like engines and so on, they're all part and parcel of European supply chains. They're distributed all over the place. We've had China with what I've called here, it's got long COVID. The China economy is still very restricted, and you think of how many components actually come from China. So there's no way of seeing this just as a UK problem. It's something that's affecting the whole world. And we saw a big dip in 2020 in everything, which I'll show you in a few charts. But a lot of our trade and our economic activity is still struggling to recover. Oil and gas prices, I don't need to tell you guys about electricity, I don't need to tell you about oil and gas. Prices have gone through the roof, and I'm going to explain what that means for you as automotive manufacturers, automotive resellers, and also for your consumers as well, because that's what's important shortly. But then interest rate rises will be having an effect on car finance. They'll be having an effect on whether or not people feel like they can go and buy a car or whether they need to pay their mortgage. It's having a huge effect on the way in which the whole global economy is working, and it's creating uncertainties as well. So basically, I've put a little miserable face down there because I've said risk and uncertainty aren't going away anytime soon. You don't need an economist to tell you that. It's obvious from the people who are coming through your doors. I've called it the prawn cocktail economy. Now, this diagram, and there will be a lot of diagrams, it's just to give you something to look at while I talk. What it shows is that we've got a return to the 1970s effectively. So the economy in the 1970s, we had GDP growth slowing, we had very high inflation. We all know inflation is at over 10% at the moment. In the 1970s, we had oil prices rising. We have exactly the same situation at the moment. We've got power cuts on the horizon. We're still talking about a lot of that. Strikes. I came up by car today. We had protests on the M25. I came up by car from the south coast for the very simple reason that I couldn't guarantee that I was going to be able to get here by train. And so all of this is disrupting economic activity. Alongside that, as we've seen in the UK recently, we've had political instability. The government has created some of its own problems for itself. There's a big threat of recession hanging over the UK. The Bank of England said last week that it thought that we were going into a longer-term recession. And trade is slowing, and the International Monetary Fund, who cares about the International Monetary Fund? But they were criticising us in the 1970s, and they're criticising us again now. So all in all, the 1970s wasn't a happy picture for the UK economy. I can't say that we're in a good place now either. Now, I talked about supply chains at the beginning, and what's important here is that you are one of the most supply chain dependent sectors out there. It's absolutely critical. We can remember the 1990s and 2000s when we all talked about just-in-time delivery, focusing on getting stuff to the right place at the right time, zero stock, etc., etc. What we've found over the last 2 years, because of the COVID pandemic, and because of certain very large cargo ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal, and because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, instead of just in time, we're now talking about just in case. Now, that means getting supply and storing supply, so it's something different, which means that prices are starting to go up, even if volumes aren't. So what this graph shows you, I'll just summarize it because the colors are a bit odd, but what this graph shows you is that while we've seen the level of trade relatively flat in volume terms, as soon as the Russia-Ukraine crisis kicked off, there was a 51% price rise in global trade. Prices just went up straight away, 51%, almost overnight between February and March this year. Now that's a big number, and we're beginning to see that come through in our activities now. Now, where was a lot of that coming from? And everybody said, oh, it must be Russia-Ukraine. It must just be the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But if you look at this one, actually, the largest increase is the column on your left in imports and exports. It's China. It's China that was experiencing the largest possible price rises between January this year and March this year. Why? Because, as I said at the beginning, it's got long COVID, its own supply chains, imports are going up very much indeed, and so it means it's charging more for exports. So alongside the Russia-Ukraine crisis, we've also got supply chain crisis for components coming from China. And all of this means that the trade finance sector was also going into lockdown, and you can see what was happening with Russia at the time. Import prices actually fell, but that was because volumes fell, because of sanctions as well. So the finance around trade, the finance around supply chains was actually going into free fall because of that Russia component. And what was happening in the UK, price rise-wise, we look relatively similar to Germany and the United States. But what was actually happening was that the volume of stuff coming into the UK in February, March this year was falling through the floor as well, right the way up to May. And that affects, again, prices in the shop, prices on the forecourts. Now, where's the sector disruption coming from? And what's interesting about this is it's not automotive. And again, I'll summarize because the graph's relatively small to look at. But it was electronic goods that went up the most in price terms between February and March. And that's a reflection of what was happening in China. So the electronic components of cars, of automotives, was going up very much between January and February and into March. The price as well of oil and gas going up by around 30%, but it wasn't having an effect on automotives at that point. The effect on automotives has been much later, so it's been in April and May. So as the crisis evolved, so at the beginning what we were seeing was actually electronics, the components, and oil and gas going up a lot. So we haven't seen any increases at this point in the value of automotives, pharmaceuticals, or plastics. Plastics and automotives obviously very important in supply chains, but we're beginning to see those now. So if I look at where the prices are going up, and this is where you're going to start seeing the supply and demand factors creeping in. So start with base metals. Start with things like lithium for batteries in electric vehicles. Look at that, 92% increase between February and March, because suddenly everyone went, we're going to have to switch to electric vehicles. There's going to be an energy transition across Europe. So what do we need to do? We need to start storing up stuff that will allow us to create lithium batteries, charge points, etc. 92% in that 1 month. These are exceptionally large increases, and it's continued to rise. Now, we all know about food shortages, and we all know about cereal shortages. That's the oilseed. That's obviously something that affects consumers. But if we look at the other ones, nickel, copper, and iron and steel, they're all components of cars to a very large extent, and you can see they've gone up by huge amounts of money because nickel and copper, and to a large extent iron and steel as well, come from Russia, or they come from China, or they come from Africa, and there's a lot of geopolitics around those areas. Then look at the other side, knitted fabrics, woolen clothes, footwear, meat, cereals. That's what's affecting the people who come to buy your stuff. That's what's affecting them. And if you look, again, very high price rises for consumers in everyday life, seeing a lot of the stuff that they normally buy relatively cheaply go up. And it's been continuing ever since then. So that's where the origin of our inflation is, actually. It's not just oil and gas, it's a lot more complicated. Now, I've done this in yellow because it tells you what started to happen to import prices in the car sector. And I did it in yellow because I knew I'd have a small screen and I wanted you to be able to see it clearly. So the value of our exports has actually gone down because we're exporting less. But look at how the price of our imports is going up. That big dip that you can see is 2020. If you look at what's been happening since then, the price of everything that we're importing into the UK in the automotive sector has been going up really severely. And the orange line underneath is components. So you can see that where the inflationary pressures are coming from in car prices as well. So why is all of this relevant, and why have I kept talking about Russia-Ukraine? Well, it's because we're actually in almost an economic war. If you look at what's happened, instead of firing missiles at each other between East and West, we're actually using economics and trade as a mechanism for fighting the battle with Russia. And that's inflationary. Again, it's pushing up prices, it's breaking down institutions, and it's having a really serious effect on everyday life. But I would argue that the car sector is right in the middle of all of that. And it's impossible to separate what's going on now economically from the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And we knew there was a crisis. We knew that Russia was actually brewing this up for a lot longer. If we'd thought about it, we could have gone back to the 2014 crisis and looked at what was happening to see where the pressures would be, and to some extent prepare us for the economic storm that we're in now. So oil and gas supplies and prices had already started to tick up since COVID. There was already, when Russia walked out of OPEC negotiations at the beginning of 2020, it was already having an impact on and showing how much power it had over oil and gas prices. And it's been manipulating those ever since. That's obviously a core component to the automotive sector. Russia for the last 5 or 6 years has been pivoting to the Middle East, to Africa and to China in particular. We saw all of this. It's been happening for a long time. Post-2014, the West put an embargo on oil and gas and also on various products going into and out of Russia. So Russia switched. So instead of doing oil and gas and metals, it started doing wheat instead. And it's now the world's largest wheat exporter. So it, again, over a basic commodity, which is inflationary and which is part of everyday life, it's got a really strong stranglehold. We all know about cyber attacks. Those were brewing all the way through from 2014, but particularly intensely in the run-up to the crisis at the beginning of this year. We saw a lot of cyber attacks. Again, we could have predicted what Russia was doing and prepared ourselves for the economic storm. They were importing gold, which again was to shore up the economy because they knew that our reaction wasn't going to be a military one. It was going to be an economic one. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But then if you look at what was being imported into Russia and Belarus over the last 5 years, it was vehicles, transport vehicles, lorries and railway, a hell of a lot of transport infrastructure being built along the Belarus-Russian border for troop build-ups. Again, we could have predicted all of this. SWIFT, we've all heard about SWIFT as an alternative finance payment, as the mechanism by which finance moves around the world. they were building, China and Russia have been building, since actually Iranian sanctions, they've been building an alternative to SWIFT. And what we're seeing now is that becoming stronger, and Belarus has actually taken itself out of the SWIFT system and just put itself on to the alternative. And then right at the bottom, I've put a fish. Why on earth would I be talking about fish when I'm speaking to automotive manufacturers? Two reasons. First is because when the sanctions were imposed in 2014, by 2015, what we were beginning to see was that the UK was exporting to the Faroe Islands, and the Faroe Islands fish, and the Faroe Islands was exporting to Belarus, and Belarus became the largest exporter of fish to Russia of any other economy. Now, I'm not a geographer, I'm an economist, but if you look at the map, Belarus is actually landlocked and it doesn't have a whole lot of sea. So the reason why it was getting so much fish was from Europe diverting its fish flows through to Russia. But the other reason why is because fish and fishing regulations actually apply to an awful lot of port regulations around the world. They're coming in now as well, as in the wake of everything that's going on. And those regulations actually prevent sometimes things like electronics going into ports. Again, inflationary. But we could have seen all of this crisis brewing. So what we've done is use economic means. We've used sanctions. We've used embargoes to restrict. Now that's always going to be inflationary. So actually, the economic war that we're in is a war of inflation. It's actually we're seeing Russia know that inflation was going to be the result of all of this because of the power they had over wheat, because of the power they had over oil and gas, and that meant that the whole supply chains into key sectors was going to be disruptive. So what we've been trying to do is say to Russia, well, dollar hegemony and all that, rules-based order, we can exclude you. What's actually happened is that we're living with inflation as well, and that's dangerous because it affects everyone on the ground. It affects the ordinary people, and that can create political instability. China's a risk as well, and China is absolutely critical to the automotive supply chain. And again, we've seen where the inflationary pressures are coming from, but there's also pending battle between China and Taiwan, and the role of Taiwan is not clear at the moment, whether or not China will invade Taiwan and try and take it over. But again, it's important because Taiwan is a major producer of semiconductors, and semiconductors go into cars, they go into electric vehicles, they go into batteries, they go into solar panels. So everything that we're beginning to do with our energy transition is reliant on China, everything. So pre-Xi, the policy was keep quiet, just build economic strength, hide your light, bide your time. Subdue your enemy without fighting. It's quite a good mantra. Just get them into a box, basically, and you don't try and shoot them or anything like that. It's still China's basic law of foreign policy. You try and create competition economically rather than through military aims. And believe it or not, the Chinese had a game that they used to play when they first came into the multilateral trade system. It was called multilateral. And it was actually the rules of the World Trade Organization. It was like a game of Monopoly, and they learned how to play it at university when they were doing supply chain courses. So they know more about this than we do. Okay, so again, inflationary pressures coming from that breaking down relationship of globalization. Belt and Road, Made in China 2025, all of these big pressures. And now, what we're seeing is war, or the threat of war, in the Taiwan Strait, which has a big consequence for supply chains, actually spilling over into a peaceful conflict, which is around supply chains and how they're distributed around the world. This inflationary pressure is, and the car industry is at the heart of it, and I'm not exaggerating, it's the battle for the 21st century, because you think about what you're charged to do in terms of renewable energies. You think of what you're charged to do in terms of social networks, alternative ways of financing things and managing businesses. absolutely everything is about that transition from fossil fuels to electronic and more digital ways of doing things. Absolutely everything in the economy globally is also about reducing dependence on Russia and China. So if you think about it, think about the components that are important there, and it's rare metals, and it's lithium, and it's semiconductors, and it's all the things that go into cars, actually. So clean diesel needs urea. That largely comes from Russia. Electric power needs cobalt and lithium. That comes from Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and China. Smart energy solutions and warheads need tantalum. That largely comes from China as well. Critical minerals in supply chains, in digital, defense, automotives, also from China and Africa. So you can see why geopolitics is so important. Our supply chains rest on the geopolitics of Russia, Africa, and China, and those shift, the transition that we're in, is what's creating inflation at the moment. So I just want to perhaps end on a slightly more cheerful note, maybe slightly more cheerful. What are the big trends? Okay, inflation and recession, I think we've talked about a lot of that. Conflict and geopolitics, this is a cheerful ending, by the way. Supply chains and resources, all going to be very, very tight. There's one thing that's on the horizon that I think is actually more interesting. And we've got COP27 this week going on. It's ESG, environment, social and governance goals of businesses, sustainability. It is creating new opportunities, it is creating new markets, and it is something that's accelerating, at least in greenwash terms. Let's try and make it something that's a little bit more optimistic. So what does it mean for you guys? So, on the recession front, the Bank of England is forecasting a deep recession rather than higher interest rates. Which would you rather? Higher interest rates, deep recession? Either way, it's not good for consumer expenditure. As a result, I think we can expect consumer spending to be hit because of interest rates and inflation. I think it's fair to say people are saving. If you look at second-hand car market versus the new car market, we're beginning to see more over the last few years going into second-hand cars. The new car market might tighten, but the luxury car market could stay buoyant. And I think the reason for that is because we've got this massive inequality around the world, which is why we're in a conflict in the first place. And actually, people who are at the top end of the market will still want to buy luxury cars. I think second-hand cars are likely to become, and the repair market will stay strong, and people will begin to buy electric, and we're seeing that in consumption patterns. We're seeing hybrid vehicles, actually 2022 compared to 21, a big increase in hybrid and a big increase in electric vehicles as well. 49% growth in electric car imports, and 5% car finance growth in August 2022. So the most recent data is saying this is actually something that's bucking the trend a little bit. And then this is the big mega trend, and I think there's a lot. I've just wandered around and seen a few car finance stalls and things. Look at the levels of consumer debt when you're thinking about whether or not car finance mechanisms are going to be appropriate. Average credit card debt, £2,244. Average unsecured debt per household, £3,877. That's debt that isn't being paid down, it's just sort of stuck there. And then 10% of earnings, is 107% of earnings is the level of debt on average per person. So you're in debt to the tune of 107% of what you earn on average in the UK. It's going to create pressure on the leasing and on the bubble purchase model of car purchases. It really will. And there's a couple of charts, but what should you do about all of this? I think I think at the end, economists always give you a really bleak picture. You can do something. So new financing models, sort of more flexible financing models will work. Using some of the mobile apps, using some of the alternative financing, they are really exciting. Some of the technology solutions to finance in this space are enabling people to pay in more flexible ways. Second-hand car market doesn't need to be dowdy. It could be very exciting as a focus. And then I think this third point is the biggest area if we're going to see something bright in the future coming through. Incentivize recycling, programs and so on that can actually help your customers come back to you and recycle and use their cars to buy new cars or to recycle bits of it. There are car manufacturers that obviously prioritize this. Why not the reseller market as well? And sustainability, think of supplying charge points, more charge points, think of the solar panels on the roofs and things, so that actually we do start to transition to a sector that's got a bright future, and we get ourselves out of this hole. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rebecca. In a moment, we'll take some questions on the floor, but I've got a couple of questions to you myself, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, a few years ago, the government set a target in the UK of 2030 for end of the sale of new internal combustion engine cars, and obviously the drive to electric vehicles. With everything that's going on in the world, do you think that's completely unrealistic now, and do you, as an industry, perhaps we can hope that the government might look at that again?
I'd say with everything that's going on, rather than being unrealistic, it's been put on the back burner. And I think that's a very different to it being unrealistic. If you look at the costs of moving away from fossil fueled engines to being electric vehicles, across Europe, the cost of doing that is something in the region of €500 billion. Okay, it needs something like, 295,000 charge points per country. I mean, it's just a massive number. We're nowhere near. So rather than say we're nowhere near, I suspect the messaging will be the current situation is too complex because the levels of investment that are necessary to do that are too big.
Right, okay. Because the impact on the industry, kind of following on from that, we've seen changes in the sales models as well. So it'll be interesting how that pans out in the year ahead. You talked to a message in there was that quite a lot of the time you mentioned that we could have predicted and we could have prepared.
Yeah.
What lessons can we take from the situation now then for the future?
I think one of the big lessons of globalization, and people are calling it deglobalization. It isn't deglobalization, we still need each other. But I think the big lesson that we could have learnt was that the just-in-time system on supply chains that we had actually was creating almost a systemic risk of stuff not being delivered around, and we didn't know how dependent we were on one core source of stuff. So China or Russia or Africa, DRC for cobalt, for example. So what we can learn now is that as we move away from fossil fuels, dependency on Russia, dependency on China for components, we're going to need to take more of a just-in-case approach. That's going to push up prices, and we need to learn how to manage pushing up prices. It'll create a temporary disruption, a year, 18 months while we do it, and then I think actually we're in a stronger place subsequently.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the audience for Rebecca at the moment?
Where's whiskey?
No, nothing yet. So towards the end there, you were talking about consumer debt.
Yep.
I thought an interesting thing where you talked about the opportunity for motor retailers to work with manufacturers on kind of new financing things. We recently conducted a poll of dealers which found that more consumers are looking at longer finance terms for their motor finance, and an expectation that yes, we could see some innovation coming out as a result of the situation in motor finance.
Yeah.
So you kind of agree with that then?
So I think the longer period of debt on a car is a risk for the market, because obviously if you take a 10-year financing program against the car that ideally you'd want to churn within 3 years, then that debt becomes almost like taking out a mortgage, and it has to have new cars sort of planted in it at various points along the cycle. So it's calculating what your vehicle consumption is likely to be over your lifetime, in the same way that you do with a mortgage. So I think it's complicated. But then I think there are some really interesting, through the open banking system, for example, we've got an opportunity to be able to create finance markets where you can search around for the best car loans, you can do more, you can get that associated with your behaviours financially, where you could actually say, I want to be nudged for the best finance deals. So actually working with the banks and the open banking initiative as well is probably a very good way to go on all of that.
Okay.
So it's not just the manufacturers, it's the banks as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. As UK-based motor retailers, a lot of obviously the global macroeconomic situation is well out of their hands. But if there was one kind of key message for them to take away to the business, something that they can focus on and control in their business, what would that be?
I think it's just being fair, actually. Fair price, understanding that the consumer is under a lot of pressure, adjusting some of the sort of day-to-day things, realising that people are going to take longer to make decisions at the moment. And yes, the global economic pressure isn't directly associated to an automotive retailer or an industrial estate somewhere, but it is, because it's having an effect on everything else, and it's having an effect on consumption. So I think sometimes being aware of those things helps you understand the pain points that there are for your customers, and just working with the banks, working with the manufacturers, and working with consumer groups to understand some of those things is a very good way to go.
Fantastic, thank you. Any last questions before we finish from the audience? No? Everybody happy? Okay, in which case, please join me in showing your appreciation to Dr. Rebecca Harding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.